Hey guys, I'm here to discuss my answers for discussion board number two. This is Anthony. Question number one is define racism. How is the idea of race linked to racism? Well, the textbook defines race as a group of human individuals that are culturally similar or also they have common ancestry with each other. I believe that the ideas of race and racism are like extremely linked together because there would be no racism without race. There would be no way to classify other people into different categories aside from with race. So I believe that racism is a product of race as it only really appeared after the creation or conceptualization of race. Um, and it left a potential way to classify people into different categories, which led to more like stereotypes, I think, that just gave people a reason to take advantage of and find a way to justify their actions with it. So, question two is describe the slave codes. How were these slave codes intended to impact social relations between African and European servants and slaves? The slave codes were laws that were specifically written out that detailed the differences between the African slaves and the European indentured servants, like right wise. Um, so, first, the slaves were not allowed to marry or be free, and they had limited rights to bearing arms and owning their own land. Um, so, these were meant to weaken the bonds that any slaves and servants would have in order to prevent the coalition between them, because that was the biggest fear of the plantation owners at the time, was that they would form a group and come together to enhance their work conditions or their rights because they thought it was unfair, and they felt that they wouldn't be able to fight back if they came together against just them. So they enacted those laws, and then eventually Bacon's Rebellion happened in 1676, and so they drastically changed the laws to make them even worse. I know they gave amnesty to the indentured servants after the whole thing, but not to the African slaves. And so little things like that were meant to sever the ties that they had, so that they would not want to work together anymore. And just the plantation owners wanted to make sure that something like Bacon's Rebellion didn't happen again. Um, so everything to do with the slave codes, I believe, was just a form of just to prevent something or just kind of insurance for the plantation owners. So question three is how did Bacon's Rebellion confirm the fears of colonial plantation owners and illustrate the purpose of the slave codes enacted in the 1660s? How did the slave codes help solidify the construction of colonial America's idea of race? So Bacon's Rebellion pretty much represented everything that plantation owners were attempting to prevent with the slave codes. Um, the African slaves and indentured servants joined together to protest their work conditions, and they eventually just burned Jamestown to the ground. And this was their greatest fear to begin with, and they knew it was a matter of time, but they thought the slave codes were gonna prevent it, but they didn't. Um, and so after this all happened, they had to intensify the slave codes just to further divide the blacks and the whites together to ensure that this wouldn't happen ever again. Um, so this, I believe, led to the solidified colonial America's idea of race by just further dividing the blacks and the whites. And I think eventually, throughout the generations, the whites just developed a sense of superiority because they had better rights naturally than the blacks did. So they would develop stereotypes and see that the blacks were meant to work on plantations or do manual labor and the whites were free. So that eventually led to discrimination and, of course, scientific racism. So, question number four is how did scientists who used anthropometric techniques explain human difference? What problems did these scientists have with their data collection and analysis? What do these problems imply about science's role in the social and historical creation of race? Um, Many scientists would aim to use anthropometric techniques in order to prove that Europeans were above other races or were just superior culturally. Samuel George Morton conducted an experiment that used a study called craniometry, where he would measure the sizes of different skulls among different races in order to prove that Europeans had the bigger skulls and, by his logic, a bigger brain, which led to mental superiority. And the results were skewed because he would test certain races that were, by average, had smaller skull sizes. So he would include certain Native Americans that had the average skull size to be pretty small, and women also. But when it came to measuring the European skulls, he would only measure men, and he left out the Hindu race, as they had a small skull size average. So he kind of subconsciously just rigged the results so that what his hypothesis went out to state was proven by his evidence that he gathered. Similarly, a scientist named Braca conducted experiments, but when he would run into something that was contradictory to his hypothesis, he would come up with something that would explain why it was contradictory rather than accepting it into the results. So he would claim that people that died of natural causes had time for their brains to decay, therefore their brains were smaller. Or if they were executed, like the African slaves, their brain size didn't have the potential to atrophy and would just stay a bigger size than normal because they didn't get old. So many of these scientific experiments kind of just skewed things in their favor just so they can justify their beliefs on the Europeans being superior to them. So basically, science's role in the social and historical creation of race was basically just used to justify their actions, similarly to how they used the Bible to justify their actions. But science was, at the time, indisputable. So they would conduct experiments so that people could see that it was truth as they wanted to believe, and just kind of spread the idea that African slaves were meant to be slaves because it was kind of profitable to them. But it was mainly just used as justification.